There are stories older than pyramids, older than written law, older than the languages we still speak today. Stories that whisper of gods who were not quite like the deities we meet in later traditions. They were powerful, but strangely human. They ruled the skies, the earth, the waters. They quarreled, loved, and demanded loyalty. And at the center of it all stood a name, Anunnaki. When we hear this word today, it often comes wrapped in mystery. Some imagine visitors from the stars. Others see only fragments of clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped lines, left behind in the ruins of Mesopotamia. But the deeper we go, the more we discover a cultural treasure, a mythological framework that shaped kingship, morality, and the very idea of civilization itself. The question is simple: why did these myths survive for thousands of years, passed down from Sumer to Akkad, from Babylon to Assyria, echoing even in distant cultures long after their origin? Why did these ancient storytellers carve the names of the Anunnaki into stone, ensuring that we would still be speaking them today? To answer this, we must travel back over 4 millennia, into the river valleys between the Tigris and the Euphrates. This was Sumer, a land of reeds and floodplains, of rising cities and silent ziggurats. Here, humanity's first city-states emerged, and with them, the first codified pantheon of gods. The Anunnaki appear in the earliest Sumerian hymns and incantations, already described as a collective of powerful beings who stood above human life. According to the oldest tablets, they were descended from the sky god and the earth goddess Ki. Their very name can be read as offspring of Enki. They were not a single god, but a group, a council of sorts, shaping the fates of kings and ordinary people alike. What makes them fascinating is how fluid their identities are. Unlike the Olympians of Greece, who were fixed into a family tree, the Anunnaki could expand or shrink in number depending on the story. In one hymn, they are 7 judges of the underworld. In another, they are hundreds, scattered across heaven and earth. This flexibility hints at their role. They were not individual characters so much as archetypes, embodiments of order, judgment, and cosmic authority. The Sumerians lived in a land where nature was unpredictable. Rivers could flood with no warning, destroying crops or bringing life-giving water. Storms swept across open plains. To live here was to live under constant uncertainty. Myths like those of the Anunnaki reflected this reality. The world was governed by powers beyond human control, and yet those powers could be approached, appeased, perhaps even persuaded. Imagine the scene. A priest stands before a clay tablet, pressing signs into wet earth with a reed stylus. His words record a hymn sung at the temple of Nippur, seat of Enlil, chief among the gods. The hymn calls upon the Anunnaki to bless the city, to protect its walls, to guard its people. It is both prayer and political statement. The rulers of Sumer claim legitimacy not through swords alone, but through the approval of these cosmic judges. Even in these earliest moments, we see the dual nature of the Anunnaki. On one hand, they are guardians of order. On the other, they are fearsome arbiters, who could just as easily curse as bless. To speak their name was to acknowledge both the promise of prosperity and the shadow of punishment. There is a version of the myth where the Anunnaki are described as descending into the netherworld to weigh the souls of the dead. They sit in judgment, silent and severe, their verdict final. In this role, they foreshadow ideas that would appear centuries later in other religions: divine judgment after death, the notion of cosmic justice. But in other tales, they are tied to fertility, agriculture, and the rhythms of the seasons. A hymn might list them as those who decree destiny, ensuring that barley grows, that rivers flow, that herds multiply. In this sense, they are less distant gods and more like forces woven into daily survival. And so, from the very beginning, the Anunnaki embodied a paradox. They were countless, yet united. Remote, yet essential. Fearsome, yet protective. They mirrored the complexity of the human condition in a land where life and death could change with a single flood. What makes their story endure is not only what it says about gods, but what it says about people. The Anunnaki gave structure to uncertainty. They offered a language for kings to speak about power, for farmers to speak about harvests, for priests to speak about destiny. They were the bridge between clay and cosmos, between fragile human lives and the vastness of heaven. And as we listen to these myths, we are not just hearing about ancient gods. We are hearing the earliest echoes of something larger, the attempt of humanity to explain its place in the universe. To seek meaning, to impose order, to tell stories that made the unknown just a little less terrifying. The Anunnaki may be forgotten in name by many today, but their legacy runs deep. And as we uncover their myths, we find ourselves tracing the very roots of civilization itself. To understand the Anunnaki, we have to imagine the world of those who first spoke their names. Mesopotamia was not a single kingdom but a patchwork of city-states, each ruled by its own king, each centered around a temple that rose like a mountain over flat plains. The cities of Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur shimmered in the heat, built of mud brick that dried beneath relentless suns, their walls constantly rebuilt as rain and time wore them down. In this land, the people lived by the will of the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates carved their way from distant mountains, bringing fertile soil but also destruction. Without warning, the rivers could change course or flood, erasing fields and homes. For the Sumerians, survival meant mastering water, digging canals, building levees, and inventing systems of irrigation. It is no accident that their gods, including the Anunnaki, were often tied to natural forces. The rhythm of survival was inseparable from the rhythm of worship. Archaeologists who unearth tablets from the ruins of these cities find more than hymns. They find contracts, inventories, poems, and lists of offerings to the gods. It is here we see how deeply religion was woven into daily life. Farmers marked the seasons by rituals. Kings built legitimacy through temple construction. Even beer, a staple of the Sumerian diet, was brewed under the watch of Ninkasi, a goddess whose hymn doubles as the oldest surviving recipe. Within this vibrant cultural tapestry, the Anunnaki appear again and again, not as background characters but as essential figures. When kings claimed the throne, they spoke of their reign as decreed by the Anunnaki. When temples were built, their dedication often invoked the Anunnaki as witnesses. In these texts, we glimpse how myth shaped authority. Gods were not just distant beings but the silent partners of every decision that mattered. One city above all stood at the heart of this system, Nippur. It was not the largest, nor always the most powerful politically, but it was the religious capital of Sumer. Here stood the great temple of Enlil, the air god, who presided over the destinies of all. The Anunnaki were often described as gathering in his court, assembled like counselors around a sovereign king. In the imagination of the Sumerians, the cosmos itself mirrored their political structures. Just as a city was ruled by a council and a king, so too was heaven and earth governed by Enlil and the Anunnaki. Travel further south and you reach Uruk, one of the world's first great cities. Uruk gave us writing, monumental architecture, and legends like the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the tablets that tell of Gilgamesh's journey, we catch hints of the Anunnaki again, as powers that shape fate, as judges who decide the path of mortals. Their presence is subtle but constant, like a refrain reminding us that no hero, no matter how mighty, stands outside divine decree. It is striking how many of these myths deal with boundaries, between life and death, chaos and order, humans and gods. In each case, the Anunnaki appear at the threshold. They are not usually portrayed as the personal gods who answer prayers directly, like Inanna or Utu. Instead, they are collective arbiters, those who set the limits, who declare the rules, who sit in judgment. In a world defined by fragile borders, between fertile land and desert, flood and drought, this role would have felt both terrifying and reassuring. Even the landscapes carried their imprint. The ziggurats that rose over Mesopotamian cities were more than temples. They were stairways linking heaven and earth, architectural embodiments of the idea that the gods were near but not fully reachable. Priests climbing these terraces could symbolically ascend to meet the Anunnaki, while the people below could look up and know that their world was still tethered to the divine. Outside the city walls stretched wide plains dotted with date palms and reed beds. Shepherds led flocks along dusty tracks. Traders carried goods, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, tin and copper from distant mountains. Each caravan connected the cities of Sumer with lands far beyond, and with them traveled stories. Myths like those of the Anunnaki were not locked inside temple walls. They moved with people, whispered in markets, retold around fires at night, reshaped with every journey. There is something profoundly human about this. The Anunnaki were cosmic figures, yet their stories lived because they were told again and again by ordinary people navigating ordinary struggles. Every harvest, every war, every drought provided a new frame for the same questions: who controls our destiny? What lies beyond death? How can order be secured in a world that seems so fragile? Over time, the myths deepened. The Anunnaki were not just guardians of fate but became entwined with the story of human origin itself. According to some traditions, they were present at the beginning, shaping humanity from clay. In these tales, human beings exist not as accidents of nature but as deliberate creations, molded by divine hands and given life by divine breath. To the Sumerians, this was not just poetry. It was the foundation of their self-understanding, a belief that tied their identity to the cosmic order maintained by the Anunnaki. So when we speak of civilization, we must remember it was never only bricks and canals, laws and trade. It was also myth. Civilization is built as much from shared stories as from stone. And in Sumer, one of the first cradles of urban life, the Anunnaki stood as both the guardians and the architects of this invisible foundation. When we look for the origins of the Anunnaki, we enter one of the most intriguing frontiers of human history, the invention of writing itself. Unlike later cultures that preserved myths in scrolls or parchment, the Sumerians pressed their stories into clay. These tablets, hardened by time or fire, survive as some of the oldest written records we possess. And within them, we find the first clear mentions of the Anunnaki. The oldest layers of myth portray the Anunnaki not as a single pantheon with fixed roles, but as a collective presence, a word that could refer to a group of divine beings whose number and function shifted depending on the ritual or the hymn. In Sumerian liturgies, the Anunnaki appear as children of En, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess. Together, they stand as a bridge between heaven and earth, celestial and terrestrial. One of the earliest incantations describes them as the 50 great gods assembled in Enlil's court at Nippur. In another, they are only 7, seated in judgment in the underworld. This fluidity may sound contradictory, but in oral traditions, it was normal. Myths were not rigid, they were living stories, reshaped by context. A scribe writing for a temple ritual might emphasize the Anunnaki as benevolent guarantors of fertility. Another, writing for a funerary rite, might cast them as grim judges who weighed the dead. This adaptability is one reason the Anunnaki endured. They were not tied to one specific role but could embody many: protectors, judges, creators, destroyers. As long as people needed explanations for life's mysteries, the Anunnaki could appear in new forms to provide them. Perhaps the most striking early reference comes from a Sumerian myth sometimes called the Descent of Inanna. In this story, the goddess of love and war ventures into the underworld, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. As Inanna stands before the throne, the text describes the Anunnaki sitting with her sister, silent and imposing. They fix their gaze on Inanna, and with that gaze, they pronounce her guilty. The goddess of life is struck down, turned into a corpse, and hung on a hook. Only later, through divine intervention, does she return to the world of the living. In this story, the Anunnaki are not the stars of the drama, but their role is crucial. They represent inexorable law, the idea that even gods are subject to cosmic order. Their judgment is final, their silence more terrifying than thunder. For the people who heard this tale, it must have been a reminder that destiny was not negotiable, even for the divine. Another early myth, known as the Atrahasis in later Akkadian form, hints at a different aspect of the Anunnaki. Here, they appear connected to the creation of humanity. According to this tradition, the gods were burdened with labor, digging canals, maintaining the order of the world. The younger gods rebelled against this toil. To solve the crisis, the Anunnaki and other deities decided to fashion human beings from clay, mixing it with the blood of a sacrificed god. Humanity, then, was created to bear the labor of the divine, a servant race destined to sustain temples and fields. This story is striking for its candor. Unlike later traditions that paint humanity as beloved children of the gods, here we are more like tools, a necessary workforce to relieve the divine council of its burdens. And yet, in this harsh origin, there is also a profound truth about human life in Sumer. Labor was not optional. Survival demanded endless effort, digging, hauling, planting, building. The myth turned this daily struggle into a cosmic drama, framing it as part of humanity's very essence. From these fragments, we see the Anunnaki as central to the earliest human reflections on existence. They were present at creation, seated in judgment at death, invoked in rituals of fertility, feared as enforcers of law. Few mythological figures occupy so many dimensions at once. The way these stories were preserved is just as fascinating as their content. Imagine a scribe in Uruk, crouched over a wet tablet, stylus in hand, carefully pressing signs into clay. He is not writing for himself, but for the temple, for the king, for the gods. Each word is an offering, each line a way of fixing memory into matter. When the tablet dried, it carried not only words but also the authority of permanence. And as these tablets accumulated, in libraries, in temple storerooms, in private collections, the myths gained solidity. Oral tradition had become record. Yet even with writing, the Anunnaki remained fluid. Some texts call them the seven who decree fate, others the great gods of the earth. Their number could be 50 or hundreds. This lack of fixed definition may frustrate modern scholars, but it was a strength in myth. It meant the Anunnaki could never be reduced to a single formula. They were cosmic multiplicity itself, a reminder that divine order was vast, complex, and beyond complete comprehension. Over centuries, as Sumer gave way to Akkad, and Akkad to Babylon, the myths evolved. But the Anunnaki remained. Their roles shifted, their stories took on new layers, but their name endured like an echo. This persistence tells us something. These were not minor figures. They were the backbone of Mesopotamian religious imagination, so deeply embedded that no cultural shift could erase them. The earliest myths, then, are not just fragments of ancient literature. They are windows into the first human attempts to codify belief, to capture mystery in lines of script. In their clay-born words, we see how people sought to make sense of floods and famines, of birth and death, of power and justice. And at the heart of it all, the Anunnaki stood as timeless witnesses. The word Anunnaki refers to a collective, but within their orbit, certain figures rise into sharper focus. These gods stand at the crossroads of myth and power, embodying roles that would echo through later civilizations. To understand the Anunnaki is to understand these characters, not as static beings, but as archetypes, reflections of human fears, hopes, and longings. At the summit is An, sometimes called Anu in later Akkadian form. He is the sky god, the father of the gods, the source of authority. Though his role in myths is often distant, rarely does he act directly in stories. His presence is like the firmament itself, overarching and unshakable. He is the ultimate source from which divine power flows, and is less a character than a principle, the embodiment of cosmic sovereignty. Beside him stands Ki, the earth goddess. While her role is less prominent in surviving texts, she is crucial in genealogy. From the union of En and Ki come the Anunnaki, the divine offspring who link heaven and earth. Her quiet presence reminds us that even in the earliest myths, the marriage of sky and soil was seen as the foundation of life. But it is their son, Enlil, who emerges as one of the most commanding figures. Enlil is the god of air and storm, the force that sweeps across plains and bends reeds in the marshes. To the Sumerians, he was not just weather but authority itself, the one who held the tablets of destiny, decreeing the fate of gods and humans alike. Kings built their legitimacy through him, temples rose in his honor, and hymns describe him as both nurturing and merciless. When floods devastated Sumer, they were sometimes explained as Enlil's judgment, a reminder that divine favor was never guaranteed. Another key figure is Enki, also called Ea in Akkadian tradition. Enki is the god of water, wisdom, and creation. Unlike Enlil's stern authority, Enki is cunning, compassionate, and often a trickster. He shapes humanity from clay, provides knowledge of irrigation and crafts, and intervenes to save mortals from destruction. In the flood story of Atrahasis, it is Enki who warns the human hero to build a boat, ensuring that life endures even when the gods decree disaster. His role reveals a vital tension in the pantheon between harsh order and merciful creativity. Then comes Inanna, later known as Ishtar. She is perhaps the most complex of them all, goddess of love, war, and transformation. Inanna strides across myths with boldness and contradiction. She descends into the underworld, seeks the powers of kingship, inspires devotion, and strikes terror. Her stories are among the most vivid in Sumerian literature, revealing both the allure and danger of divine passion. Inanna's presence among the Anunnaki adds dynamism. She is not bound by one role but embodies the restless energy of life itself. We must also mention Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. If Inanna represents vitality, Ereshkigal represents its inevitable counterpoint. She rules the realm of the dead, a shadowy mirror of the living world. When Inanna descends, it is before Ereshkigal and the Anunnaki judges that she must submit. In this, the myth reflects a deep truth: life and death are not enemies, but partners in a cycle. Ereshkigal's authority reminds us that no divine or human figure escapes the balance. Other deities appear around the edges: Utu, the sun god, who brings light and justice; Nanna, the moon god, tied to cycles of time and fertility; Ninhursag, the mother goddess, connected with mountains and wombs. Each of them contributes to the fabric of the Anunnaki's presence. What is striking is how these figures reflect archetypes that would later reappear in distant cultures. Enlil, the storm god who commands destiny, resembles Zeus among the Greeks, or Jupiter among the Romans. Enki, the wise trickster who saves humanity, has echoes of Prometheus, who brings fire to mortals, or Odin, who sacrifices for wisdom. Inanna, goddess of love and war, finds parallels in Aphrodite and Athena, but also in figures like Freya in Norse mythology, who embodies both beauty and ferocity. Even the underworld judges evoke comparisons. The idea of 7 divine arbiters weighing souls appears later in Egyptian tradition, with the weighing of the heart before Osiris. Such parallels do not mean direct borrowing, but they suggest that human cultures, separated by geography, often arrive at similar ways of making sense of fate, justice, and mortality. The Anunnaki, then, are not merely a local pantheon of one ancient land. They represent something larger, the archetypal roles through which humanity has always told stories about itself. Authority and rebellion, creation and destruction, love and death, these are not only Sumerian themes. They are universal, woven into the myths of nearly every civilization. In the Sumerian imagination, the Anunnaki were both individuals and a collective. They were characters in stories, but also forces of nature, cosmic offices that had to be filled. When floods came, it was Enlil's storm. When wisdom was needed, it was Enki's counsel. When passion burned, it was Inanna's fire. Each role was essential, each reflected some dimension of human life projected onto the heavens. By focusing on these figures, we see the richness of the Anunnaki tradition. They are not shadowy, faceless judges only, but living personalities with desires, conflicts, and contradictions. And as we follow their stories further, we begin to see why they fascinated not only the Sumerians but also every culture that inherited their memory. Among the many stories preserved on clay tablets, one stands out for its drama and its insight into how the Anunnaki were imagined: the tale of the Great Flood. Versions of this myth appear across Mesopotamian cultures, from early Sumerian fragments to the Akkadian Atrahasis and the later Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. Though details shift, the core is clear: a divine counsel, a decision to destroy, and a fragile thread of survival. According to the tradition, the world was young, but humanity had multiplied quickly. People filled the land with their clamor, working, feasting, singing, and quarreling. To the gods, this noise became unbearable. The Anunnaki, gathered in council, weighed the matter. They were tired of the endless cries of mortals, tired of the burden humanity represented. It was Enlil, the stern god of storm and authority, who spoke most forcefully. He declared that the earth had become too noisy, too unruly. The humans must be wiped away. His words carried the weight of judgment, and the Anunnaki, seated in solemn agreement, consented to the decree. The decision was final: the flood would come. But not all gods agreed in their hearts. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, looked upon humanity with compassion. To him, mortals were not merely a nuisance but the necessary partners in sustaining the temples and the rhythm of the world. Enki could not openly defy the council, that would unravel cosmic order. Yet he found another way. The myth tells us that Enki whispered to the walls of a reed hut, knowing that his chosen mortal, Atrahasis, would be nearby to hear. Through this indirect warning, he gave instructions: build a vessel, seal it with pitch, bring aboard family, seeds, and animals. In this act of subtle rebellion, Enki preserved the thread of life, ensuring that not all would be lost. The flood came as promised. The skies opened, the rivers swelled, and for days the world was drowned beneath roaring waters. Entire cities vanished, fields disappeared, and silence fell where once there had been noise. The Anunnaki watched, their decree carried out with ruthless completeness. Yet in the depths of the storm, Atrahasis's vessel floated, fragile, but unbroken. When the waters receded, the survivor emerged, offering sacrifice to the gods. The smoke of his offering rose into the heavens, and the gods gathered around it like starving men. The myth describes them as desperate, hungry, for without humanity, there had been no temples, no offerings, no sustenance. In this moment, regret entered the divine council. Enlil raged when he discovered that mortals had survived. But Enki spoke with calm wisdom, urging a new balance. Instead of wiping out humanity, the gods could limit its excesses through natural measures, shorter lifespans, disease, and famine. Harsh though these sound, they were seen as mercies compared to total annihilation. The Anunnaki agreed. From then on, humanity would endure, fragile but persistent, living in cycles of challenge and renewal. This flood myth resonates for many reasons. It is not merely a story of destruction but of negotiation, between severity and compassion, between order and survival. The Anunnaki appear not as distant abstractions but as beings wrestling with choices, capable of both cruelty and restraint. Their judgment was absolute, but not beyond reconsideration. The narrative also reflects Sumerian reality. Floods were a constant threat, capable of erasing villages overnight. To live in Mesopotamia was to live with water's double face, the giver of fertility and the bringer of ruin. By framing this experience in myth, the Sumerians made sense of the uncontrollable. Every flood became part of a divine drama, every survival a reminder of fragile grace. And there is another layer. The story encodes a philosophy of limits. Humanity is noisy, abundant, prone to excess, but it must be kept in balance. The flood was not just punishment but a cosmic reset, a reminder that existence itself depends on harmony with forces greater than ourselves. Later, echoes of this tale would ripple far beyond Sumer. In Babylon, the hero became Utnapishtim. In Hebrew scripture, he became Noah. The shape of the story changed, but its bones remained: divine judgment, a flood, a chosen survivor, a covenant with life. Each culture reinterpreted it, but the roots point back to those first councils of the Anunnaki, where fate itself was decided. The flood myth, then, is more than a tale of survival. It is a window into how the Sumerians saw their gods, not omnibenevolent, not unchanging, but complex figures wrestling with the same dilemmas as humans. Power, justice, mercy, regret. In the Anunnaki, people saw the drama of existence writ large across the heavens. And as Atrahasis stepped onto dry ground, as smoke curled from his altar, the fragile pact between humans and gods was renewed. Life would go on, but never again would it be limitless. The flood story is only one strand in a much wider web of traditions. As centuries passed and empires rose and fell, the myths of the Anunnaki evolved. Each culture that inherited them reshaped their roles, adding new meanings and new layers of complexity. What began as Sumerian hymns became Akkadian epics, Babylonian theology, and Assyrian state propaganda. One variation of the flood myth, preserved in Akkadian texts, emphasizes the secrecy of Enki's act. In this telling, he does not speak directly to Atrahasis at all but addresses the wall of a house, whispering his warning to the clay itself. The detail is subtle but telling. Enki preserves order by technically obeying the council's decree while still ensuring survival. This legalistic twist reveals how Mesopotamians viewed the gods, bound by cosmic rules, finding loopholes even in divine law. In Babylon, the Anunnaki's roles expand. They are no longer only the offspring of Enki, but a broader class of deities associated with judgment and destiny. The Babylonian Enuma Elish, the great creation epic, describes a world born out of chaos, where younger gods battle older ones. Marduk, the Babylonian patron, rises as chief deity, but even in his triumph, the Anunnaki remain as part of the divine order. They are described as builders, constructing Babylon's grand temple after Marduk slays the primordial chaos dragon Tiamat. In this version, the Anunnaki are not simply judges, they are cosmic laborers, shaping the very structures of creation. In Assyrian texts, we see yet another shift. Here, the Anunnaki are closely tied to the underworld, often listed as the 7 judges who sit beside Ereshkigal. Their function becomes darker, more severe. The emphasis is less on fertility and blessing, more on death and punishment. This reflects Assyria's own cultural lens, a militarized empire that defined itself through conquest and control. Their gods, like their kings, were imagined as stern arbiters of life and death. Yet even within Mesopotamia, variations abounded. In some hymns, the Anunnaki are invoked as benevolent forces who guarantee the abundance of barley, the growth of date palms, the fertility of herds. Farmers may have prayed to them as allies in survival. In other contexts, they are terrifying judges, invoked in curses inscribed on boundary stones. May the Anunnaki curse anyone who violates this land. The same name could evoke blessings in one setting and fear in another. We also find regional differences in number. Some texts describe the 7 Anunnaki, others the 50, and still others speak of hundreds. Modern scholars often struggle to reconcile these contradictions, but the fluidity itself is part of the myth's power. The Anunnaki were not a rigid group but a shifting category, adapted to suit different needs. To a priest of Nippur, they might be the high council around Enlil. To a family burying their dead, they might be the stern judges of the underworld. To a farmer, they were guarantors of harvest. Beyond Mesopotamia, echoes of the Anunnaki spread. In the Hurrian traditions to the north, we find gods of fate and underworld judgment with striking similarities. In Hittite myths of Anatolia, there are councils of older gods banished to the underworld, resembling the Anunnaki in both role and imagery. Even in Greek mythology, the Titans, older deities overthrown by Zeus and his Olympians, carry a faint echo of the same archetype, a generation of primordial powers, displaced yet still lingering at the edges of cosmic order. These parallels remind us of a crucial point. Myths do not stay still. They travel with merchants, soldiers, and storytellers. As ideas moved across the Fertile Crescent, they were reshaped to fit new languages, new landscapes, new political needs. The Anunnaki survived not because they were fixed, but because they were flexible. They could be 7 judges, or 50 divine architects, or a whole host of ancestral powers. Their essence was adaptability, and this made them durable across time. One particularly fascinating variation appears in texts that associate the Anunnaki with the stars. In some Babylonian astronomical writings, they are linked with constellations, suggesting that their role was not only terrestrial but also cosmic. Just as priests read omens in the liver of a sacrificial animal, they also read the heavens. To them, the stars were the writing of the gods, and the Anunnaki were part of that celestial script. Here, the Anunnaki transcend myth and become part of proto-science, a way of mapping destiny onto the sky. What unites all these versions is the underlying idea of authority. Whether as judges of the dead, guarantors of fertility, or cosmic builders, the Anunnaki embody the forces that sustain or constrain life. Their multiplicity is not confusion, but richness. They are mirrors of the many ways humans experience the divine, in harvests, in floods, in law, in death, and the stars above. Thus, by the time Mesopotamia's city-states gave way to empires, the Anunnaki had become more than just local gods. They were cultural constants, invoked in rituals from Ur to Nineveh, adapted to each new order yet always recognizable. Their names were carved into boundary stones, recited in incantations, and embedded in epic poetry. They became part of the very grammar of the ancient Near Eastern imagination. Myth is never just about characters. It is also about the symbols that surround them, the numbers, animals, objects, and elements that give shape to invisible truths. In the case of the Anunnaki, symbols play a powerful role in helping us understand not only who they were, but how the people of Mesopotamia interpreted the cosmos itself. Numbers appear first. In some traditions, the Anunnaki are described as 7 in number. 7, in Mesopotamian thought, was not arbitrary. It recurs again and again: 7 gates of the underworld, 7 winds, 7 sages. The number conveyed completeness, a sense of cosmic order. To describe the Anunnaki as 7 was to present them as the perfect circle of judgment, the full council whose decisions could not be overturned. But in other contexts, the number grows to 50, or even hundreds. 50 had its own significance. It was the sacred number of Enlil, chief among the gods. To call the Anunnaki 50 was to place them under his authority, to fold them into the vastness of his command. This variability is telling. Numbers here are not literal tallies but symbolic registers, ways of saying that the Anunnaki could be as small as a tribunal or as vast as a cosmic assembly. Animals also carried symbolic weight. The bull, for instance, was tied to strength and divine power, often associated with storm gods like Enlil. In myths where the Anunnaki appear as judges or warriors, bulls sometimes flank their imagery, embodying unshakable authority. The lion, fierce and untamed, is linked to Inanna, whose presence among the Anunnaki brought both passion and destruction. Serpents slither through Mesopotamian iconography too, sometimes as guardians of wisdom, other times as symbols of chaos, reflecting the Anunnaki's dual role as bringers of order and agents of fear. Objects, too, carried meaning. The tablets of destiny, cosmic records said to contain the decrees of fate, are often connected to Enlil and the Anunnaki. Whoever held them possessed supreme authority, the power to determine the course of the universe. Stories describe these tablets being stolen, lost, and recovered, suggesting that even the gods could experience shifts in fortune. In such myths, the Anunnaki stand as custodians of order, but order itself is fragile, requiring constant vigilance. The underworld gates present another potent symbol. In the story of Inanna's descent, she must pass through 7 gates, at each one surrendering a piece of her clothing or jewelry. By the time she reaches Ereshkigal and the Anunnaki judges, she stands naked and stripped of power. The gates symbolize not only physical thresholds but also stages of transformation, a journey from pride to humility, from life to death. The Anunnaki, waiting at the end, embody the ultimate stripping away, the final judgment that nothing can resist. Even natural elements became symbols of the Anunnaki's authority. The rivers, with their floods and fertile silt, represented both blessing and curse. Storms, with thunder and lightning, were signs of divine wrath. The starry sky above, vast, patterned, yet unpredictable, was itself read as the writing of the gods. Babylonian star charts sometimes linked the Anunnaki to constellations, hinting that their authority extended beyond Earth into the heavens. To the ancients, the sky was not empty space but a living text, and the Anunnaki were part of the grammar that made it intelligible. These symbols carried into ritual. A farmer might pour out a libation to the Anunnaki before sowing barley, invoking their blessing on the harvest. A king might dedicate a statue or boundary stone inscribed with curses, calling upon the Anunnaki to enforce the decree. A grieving family might whisper their names in funerary rites, hoping the judges of the underworld would show mercy to the departed. In each act, symbols bridged the gap between myth and daily survival. Even architecture carried symbolic resonance. The ziggurat, with its ascending terraces, was more than a building. It was a cosmic mountain, a meeting point of heaven and earth. To climb it was to rise into the presence of the gods, to stand closer to the Anunnaki who decreed destinies. The very bricks were prayers, stacked one upon another, embodying the hope that divine order might be anchored in clay and stone. What makes these symbols enduring is their universality. Even if a listener did not understand every theological nuance, they could feel the meaning in a number, an animal, or a storm. Symbols allowed the myths of the Anunnaki to transcend literacy, geography, and time. A shepherd could watch thunder roll across the plains and remember Enlil. A trader could see constellations on his journey and recall the Anunnaki's cosmic presence. A mourner could pass through the ritual gates of burial and see in them a reflection of Inanna's path. And so the Anunnaki lived not only in stories but in patterns, in numbers and cycles, in animals and stars, in gates and floods. These symbols wove their presence into the fabric of daily existence, ensuring that even when names shifted, their meaning remained. Although the temples of Sumer crumbled long ago, the Anunnaki never fully vanished. Their names may have faded from everyday speech, but their echoes linger, in languages, in rituals, and stories retold across millennia, and even in the modern imagination. To trace these echoes is to see how myths evolve, never dying, only transforming. One of the clearest legacies is linguistic. Many Mesopotamian deities carried over into Akkadian and Babylonian forms, their names adapted as cultures shifted. And became Anu, Inanna became Ishtar, Enki became Ea. The word Anunnaki itself endured as a term for a collective of gods, appearing in texts for nearly 2,000 years. Even when empires changed, scribes still wrote the wedge-shaped signs that preserved their memory. Festivals and rituals also carried their imprint. The Akitu festival in Babylon, a New Year's celebration, included ceremonies that echoed older Sumerian practices. In these rituals, the gods were invoked to renew cosmic order for another year, ensuring prosperity and fertility. Though the Anunnaki were not always named explicitly, the idea of divine councils decreeing fate remained central. The rhythm of ritual preserved their presence long after their temples had fallen silent. In literature, the Anunnaki's legacy is profound. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving works of literature, weaves their influence throughout. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality leads him to Utnapishtim, the flood survivor preserved by Enki's intervention against the council's decree. The Anunnaki hover in the background as the forces that limit mortal ambition. Even the great king cannot escape the destiny they set. These themes resonated beyond Mesopotamia. Biblical writers, living centuries later in the same lands, were heirs to these stories. The flood narrative in Genesis shares clear parallels with the Atrahasis tradition. The image of divine councils appears in Hebrew texts too, suggesting that the memory of assemblies of gods like the Anunnaki lingered in cultural memory. In this way, the Anunnaki are part of the shared heritage of Western religious imagination, even if their name is forgotten. In more recent centuries, their echo took new forms. Archaeologists in the 19th century, unearthing tablets from Nineveh and Ur, stumbled upon unfamiliar names: Anu, Enlil, Ea, Inanna, and the Anunnaki. For the first time in millennia, the Council of Sumer returned to human awareness. Newspapers marveled at these discoveries. Scholars debated their meaning. And soon, artists and writers began to draw inspiration from them. By the 20th century, the Anunnaki had leapt into popular imagination in unexpected ways. Science fiction authors, fascinated by the mystery of ancient gods, reimagined them as extraterrestrial visitors, powerful beings who shaped early civilization. While such interpretations stray far from the historical record, they reveal something important: the Anunnaki still have the power to captivate. They embody mystery, authority, and origins, themes that remain magnetic to modern minds. Movies, novels, and video games have all borrowed from this reservoir. The very word Anunnaki now carries an aura of ancient power, instantly conjuring images of forgotten temples, secret wisdom, and cosmic influence. For audiences unfamiliar with Mesopotamian history, the name may sound exotic, even alien, but beneath these modern reimaginings lies the same core idea: beings who shaped destiny, beings who stood at the beginning of order. Even in psychology, echoes remain. The idea of a divine council, of unseen judges who decide human fate, parallels concepts of the superego and collective conscience. The Anunnaki can be seen as projections of humanity's awareness that life is shaped by forces beyond our control, be they nature, society, or the cosmos itself. This is why they resonate even when removed from their cultural roots. They symbolize the enduring human sense that destiny is larger than the individual. And perhaps the most striking legacy is this: the rediscovery of the Anunnaki has reminded us that our oldest stories are not simple. They are layered, complex, contradictory, just as human life is. Far from being relics of a vanished world, they are part of a living conversation about what it means to exist, to struggle, to hope. So when the name Anunnaki appears in a book or film today, it is not just fantasy. It is the echo of a civilization 4,000 years old, a voice carried across time by clay tablets and memory. It is proof that myths do not die, they change, they adapt, they find new hosts. And in doing so, they remain. For modern readers, the Anunnaki can feel like a riddle. Were they gods, ancestors, cosmic judges, or symbols? To answer this, we turn to science, to archaeology, anthropology, and psychology, not to strip away the magic, but to see how myth and evidence speak to one another. Archaeology offers our first insights. The earliest references to the Anunnaki appear on Sumerian tablets dating back more than 4,000 years. These texts were found in temple libraries and palace archives, often preserved by accident when fires baked clay tablets into permanence. In them, the Anunnaki are invoked in prayers, curses, and hymns. Scholars note that the word itself seems to mean offspring of Enki, literally children of heaven and earth. This points to their function, mediators between cosmic realms. The fluidity of their identity, sometimes 7, sometimes 50, sometimes hundreds, makes sense in an oral culture. Anthropologists remind us that myths were not fixed stories but living traditions. Just as folk tales today shift in retelling, so too did the Anunnaki's roles. One singer might portray them as judges of the dead, another as guarantors of fertility, another as builders of temples. The variations are not errors, they reflect the adaptability of myth to different social needs. Historians also highlight the political role of these myths. In Sumer, kingship was not only secular authority. It required divine approval. Texts often declare that a king's reign was decreed by the Anunnaki. This was more than poetry. It was a claim that power was legitimate because it was aligned with cosmic order. In this sense, the Anunnaki were less characters and more a symbol of divine bureaucracy, the heavenly council that validated human rule. Comparative religion adds another layer. Councils of gods appear across many cultures. The Greek Olympians, the Norse Aesir, the Hindu Devas, all reflect the human tendency to imagine the divine as a society, mirroring human political life. The Anunnaki were perhaps the earliest recorded example of this, revealing that our ancestors projected their city-states and councils into the heavens, creating a cosmos that looked like their world magnified. Psychology, especially the work of thinkers like Carl Jung, offers yet another perspective. Archetypes, recurring figures and roles in myth, reveal patterns in the human psyche. The Anunnaki as judges resemble the archetype of the stern father, the authority that defines boundaries. Enki, the wise savior, reflects the trickster helper, a figure found in cultures worldwide. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, embodies the paradoxical archetype of life force, both nurturing and destructive. From this view, the Anunnaki are not external beings but internal symbols, mirrors of human experience projected onto the cosmos. Modern science also helps demystify the natural phenomena tied to these myths. Floods, for example, were not divine punishment but predictable events in river valleys. Yet for ancient peoples, their scale and suddenness demanded explanation. Myths of the Anunnaki provided that explanation, giving chaos a face, turning disaster into narrative. In this way, myth functioned as early science, a way to impose order on the unpredictable. At the same time, scholars caution us not to dismiss these myths as mere superstition. They were cultural tools. They structured societies, justified laws, and gave meaning to suffering. They connected daily life to the cosmos, making survival feel purposeful rather than random. The endurance of the Anunnaki myth shows that it met deep human needs, needs that persist even in scientific ages. And then there is the modern fascination with alternative theories, the idea that the Anunnaki were not gods at all but visitors from the stars. Popularized in the 20th century by writers like Zecharia Sitchin, these theories claim that ancient Mesopotamians were describing extraterrestrials with advanced technology. Mainstream scholars reject these ideas, noting that they misread or distort cuneiform texts. But their popularity reveals something important: the Anunnaki continue to serve as a canvas for humanity's questions about origins. Are we alone? Did knowledge come from beyond? Why do ancient myths feel so strangely timeless? In the end, science and myth are not enemies but partners. Archaeology uncovers the tablets. Anthropology explains how oral traditions shift. Psychology interprets the archetypes. Myth, meanwhile, preserves the emotional truth of how it felt to live in a fragile world, at the mercy of floods and storms, seeking order in the stars. The Anunnaki stand at the crossroads of both ancient poetry and modern inquiry, divine figures and human archetypes. So when we read of the Anunnaki today, we can see them in two lights. As myth, they are cosmic judges, creators, guardians of order. As history, they are the projection of early urban societies trying to explain power, nature, and fate. Both truths coexist. And it is in this coexistence that their endurance lies. The story of the Anunnaki begins in the floodplains of Mesopotamia, and cities built from mud brick and hymns pressed into clay. It begins with human beings looking up at the sky and down at the earth, asking what forces govern life, what powers decide destiny. Over thousands of years, those questions have not faded. The names have changed, the languages have shifted, but the need to seek meaning remains. What makes the Anunnaki so enduring is not only the myths themselves, but the way they mirror our deepest concerns. They stand as judges, reminding us of limits. They appear as creators, reminding us of origins. They shift in number and role, reminding us that truth is rarely simple, that life resists a single explanation. In their stories we hear echoes of floods, harvests, love, loss, and the constant tension between order and chaos. For the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were guardians of the balance between heaven and earth. For Babylonians, they became cosmic builders and arbiters of fate. For Assyrians, they were judges of the underworld. For us today, they are a reminder of how ancient people grappled with the unknown, and how their imagination still resonates in our own. Even in their contradictions, there is wisdom. The Anunnaki are many, yet one. They are merciful, yet severe. They are distant, yet ever-present. Such paradoxes reflect the complexity of human life itself, our need for justice and compassion, our fear of death and hope for renewal, our longing to believe that the universe has order even when chaos surrounds us. When archaeologists rediscovered their names in the 19th century, the world was astonished. Suddenly, the forgotten gods of Sumer spoke again after 4,000 years of silence. They told us that civilization is older than we imagined, that writing itself was born in service to myth, that our earliest ancestors were already asking the same questions we ask now: who are we? Why are we here? What governs our fate? And in modern times, the Anunnaki continue to spark imagination. Some see them in science fiction, others in psychology, others still in the shared heritage of myth that flows from Mesopotamia into the Bible, into Greece, into stories we still tell today. Whether as divine judges, celestial archetypes, or symbols of power, they remain alive in culture, never fully gone. Perhaps this is the true lesson of the Anunnaki. Myths are not fossils, fixed and dead. They are rivers, flowing, splitting, joining again. They adapt to new lands, new languages, new audiences. The Sumerians told them to explain floods. The Babylonians told them to justify kingship. We tell them to explore our place in the cosmos. And in each retelling, they gain new life. So as we close this journey, let us not think of the Anunnaki as strange, distant deities locked in dusty tablets. Let us think of them as companions in the oldest human quest, to seek order in chaos, to connect the clay of our lives to the stars above. Their myths are not just about gods. They are about us, about humanity's first attempt to understand the fragile, beautiful, terrifying gift of existence. And that is why, thousands of years later, we still speak their name. Anunnaki. The children of heaven and earth. Forgotten by time, remembered by myth. Guardians of one of the greatest treasures humanity has ever created, the story of civilization itself.